Sergio Moro, the right-wing judge in Brazil who imprisoned Jair Bolsonaro's political opponent, Lula da Silva, leading up to the 2018 presidential election, is now actually running against Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil. And I love it when bad guys fight. Let them fight. And I love the fact that this is actually increasing the chances of the leftist candidate, Lula da Silva, from winning. So Bolsonaro actually lost support from the majority of the country, and it has to do with a number of different things, including his own corruption, but also his response to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the right worshipped Sergio Moro for his role as judge who put former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva behind bars on corruption charges. The popularity propelled Moro to high office as justice minister under far-right President Jair Bolsonaro, who won the 2018 election, but only after the front-runner Lula was made ineligible by Moro's sham conviction. And I'll give you the details on why that conviction was a sham in just a moment. But why is Moro now running against Bolsonaro, the individual who he assisted in winning the 2018 election, the individual who named him as a justice minister under his administration? Well, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that Moro resigned from his post in the Bolsonaro government because of the fact that he was allegedly concerned with Bolsonaro undermining Moro. He was concerned that Bolsonaro was meddling in the ability of law enforcement to do its job. Now, there are more details on that in this video. Let's take a quick look at that.
Sergio Moro resigned as Brazil's justice minister. On live television, he accused President Jair Bolsonaro of political meddling in matters of law enforcement when he fired federal police chief Mauricio Valeixo the day before.
Unfortunately, there's no way for me to fulfill the commitment I made if I'm not able to do my job, if I'm not able to preserve the autonomy of the federal police to carry out its work.
Sergio Moro's resignation comes just over a week after President Bolsonaro fired his health minister, Luiz Mandetta, signaling there could be more political turmoil still to come.
Now, Moro stepped down back in 2020, and ever since then, it seems that there's been a bit of a feud taking place between Bolsonaro and Moro. But I want to be clear about something. While Moro is presenting himself as some sort of anti-corruption warrior, someone who wants to protect the independence of law enforcement to do its job, do not make any mistakes about Moro's own corruption, his collusion with Bolsonaro in an effort to turn Lula da Silva into a political prisoner. And guess what? That conviction, that sham conviction, luckily fell apart. And as a result, his whole, I guess, persona as this anti-corruption individual is really no longer valid. And it's showing in some of the polling. Now, let me give you the details on what happened with that sham conviction. So the Supreme Court freed Lula and vacated Moro's ruling, determining that the judge acted with bias after The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald to be specific, revealed compromising secret chat logs showing illicit collusion between Moro and the prosecutors. This was prior to Glenn Greenwald losing his mind, but it was good reporting at the time. Now, attempts to revive the cases against Lula have subsequently been thrown out, leaving Moro's legacy damaged. It was yet another hit to Moro's credibility, which was decimated during his brief, controversial, and at times humiliating tenure in the Bolsonaro government, culminating in an anticlimactic, acrimonious departure in 2020. And guess what? Moro quit working under Bolsonaro's government to work in Washington, D.C. What was he doing there? Well, following his high-paying consulting gig in Washington, and even work on behalf of an Israeli billionaire accused of corruption and rights abuses, Moro is now running for president himself. Isn't it funny how the guy who really presented himself as this anti-corruption warrior then ended up working as a consultant in DC? It is pretty amazing stuff, right? Now, Moro has made an effort to avoid any questions pertaining to his anti-corruption work, even going so far as to avoiding speaking to crowds during book signings and things like that. He avoids even the possibility of being ambushed by anyone who wants to ask him a tough question about his record. Now, while Brazil's mainstream media often ignores Lula or casts him in a negative light, Moro, unfortunately, suffers no shortage of glowing coverage despite his lackluster polling numbers and vague policy proposals. Moro was featured on the front page of the influential O Global newspaper once every 3 days. Other major newspapers, radio stations, and television networks were similarly attentive. And unfortunately, there has been little, if any, critical coverage of Moro's scandals. But while the media in Brazil, much like the media here in the United States, prefers this corrupt politician over a leftist like Lula da Silva, who lifted literally millions of people out of poverty, it doesn't seem like the media's coverage is working so far, okay? So a little more information about him, and then I'll give you the update on where he stands in the current polling. Moro represents a part of Brazilian society, which includes a large share, according to The Intercept, of the media that does not accept Lula and is ashamed of its previous support for Bolsonaro. His strategy will be to try to sustain the character that was created for him, that anti-corruption character. I think this character is out of step with Brazil today, but it is a character that corresponds with many of the interests of some powerful groups in Brazil. And that's according to a Brazilian studies professor over at the University of Oklahoma. And so where does everything stand today with this election, with this race? Well, facing off against both his far more charismatic arch nemesis, though, the former judge is struggling to break into double digits in polling. Awesome. The resurgent Lula, on the other hand, is ascendant, polling at nearly 50% with the lowest negative numbers of any major candidate. For his part, Bolsonaro, battered by an ailing economy and his administration's disastrous handling of COVID-19, is only managing to attract, oh, so sad, just over 20% of voters. And so the voting for this election is scheduled to take place in October of this year. As we know, a lot can happen in 10 months, so we'll see how this all plays out. But things are looking great for Lula da Silva. And remember, he was made a political prisoner by Sergio Moro, and things seemed incredibly dire for him. But luckily, there was excellent reporting that outed Moro as someone who colluded to make Lula da Silva political prisoner, and all of those charges have completely fallen apart. That conviction has fallen apart. And to be sure, among the people of Brazil, Lula does command quite a bit of popularity, not only because of the fact that he is untouched by the disgusting behavior that we're seeing by both Bolsonaro and Moro, but more importantly, because he did in fact lift millions of Brazilians out of poverty when he once led the country. And I think that stability, that economic growth that happened under his watch and under his leftist policies really does reign supreme and really does send a message in this election. Hopefully that message remains, and hopefully the people of Brazil make the right choice here. Because I will say this, Bolsonaro has been a complete and utter disaster for the country, and even his supporters, his most avid supporters, have realized that.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.